Devin, Cecil-Wishing, welcome to the Undraped Artist podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Man, yeah, it's great to have you, man. I'm a huge fan of your work. It's
Thank you.
seriously unbelievable work.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm dying to pick your brain because we paint quite different. And that fascinates me because I love to learn from people who approach the art differently. So I'm excited about this next couple hours. This will be fun.
Great. Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Tell me a little about yourself. So how did you end up getting into painting, becoming a painter?
Yeah, it was sort of a roundabout journey, I guess, in some ways. I don't know. I guess depending on how you look at it, maybe it might look straightforward.
Yeah.
But I got into art pretty young. I always say I was probably about 12, I think, when I had always drawn, because I think up to about roughly kind of age 12, I think sort of everybody kind of draws, and usually that's when there's a lot of drop off, when people kind of either really kind of do it or stop. And for me, it was right about the time that I got really sort of interested in it. And for me, there was initially a pretty specific catalyst, actually. And it was that I saw this documentary. It was called Crumb. It was about the cartoonist R. Crumb. And my 12-year-old brain was like, oh, this is the thing.
Really?
And just fell in love with it. And so I got really, really into cartooning for like quite a few years, actually, and making comics and cartoons and lots of pen and ink stuff and things like that.
So
And
were you copying other cartoons or making up your own characters or both?
Both.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, there was lots of stuff that I would sort of copy, just in a kind of learning to draw, learning how the medium worked a little bit. But yeah, then definitely, I mean, making my own, characters and cartoons and stuff, and doing stuff like that. And that sort of led me into some other people. I started looking at people like, Victor Moscoso, Rick Griffin, some guys like that.
Are these
Who
all
I got.
cartoonists?
Yeah, sort of. So they did do cartoons. Those guys are mostly kind of known for like concert posters and stuff. So
Oh,
like
okay.
if you look at like Fillmore posters from the 60s and stuff, like you'll see a lot of those guys. And I grew up in San Francisco, so it was all kind of local to me, in a way. And so I really, really loved those guys, and got into a lot of kind of poster art and things like that, from there. And that sort of led me a little bit into the next person who I got really into when I was a teenager was Salvador Dali.
Hmm.
And who I sort of went from this kind of R. Crumb phase into this Dali phase, and probably when I was about, I don't know, 18 or so. And right around that time, I was kind of like, I think I want to like learn how to actually paint, because I was like, I have these ideas for paintings, but like I don't really have like the skill, right,
Mm-hmm.
to actually pull them off. And so at the time, I decided to go to art school. And so I went to an art school back in the Bay Area, the California College of the Arts, which was at the time it was kind of in Oakland and San Francisco. It had a split campus, and I went there, and not really knowing much about anything really, and signed up for some painting classes and drawing classes and some illustration classes, and just looking to kind of get some foundational skills, and pretty quickly realized that the painting department wasn't really going to do that so
Yeah.
much. Um, and so I wound up majoring in illustration, basically because, I was like, okay, well, these guys are kind of like at least telling me if I draw a hand and it looks weird or, something
Right.
like that. And so I wound up, I did a degree in illustration and finished up there and I started working doing a little bit of work as an illustrator for a while, things, for
Hmm.
magazines and some newspapers and stuff like that. And pretty quickly, doing it for real, realized sort of like, this isn't actually the thing I wanted to do. And in this funny kind of way, I felt like I sort of just fell into it because I was like trying to learn how to draw.
Hmm.
And very much by accident around that time, I met somebody who introduced me to an atelier back in Oakland, which was run and still is run by a guy named David Hardy. And I found that place and, was instantly like, oh, I was like, these guys are trying to do the thing that I'm trying to do, right? This
Yeah.
is this is kind of actually, I guess, more what I was sort of looking for in a way. And
Hey,
so I studied there for
back
a
up
few
a little bit.
years.
I want to
Yeah,
get, I got a question for you. So
yeah,
what it
yeah.
was it about the illustration life that didn't appeal to you?
Mm, yeah. Um, different people have different feelings on this, and
Yeah.
one thing I learned really quickly kind of about myself doing illustration work is that kind of the second that I can't make the picture be what I want it to be, I sort of lose interest in it.
Oh, right.
And the thing that I always say is, with doing illustration, you would come up with sketches and ideas and show them to your art director or whoever the client was, and then they'd make some adjustments and some tweaks and things and I always say they weren't even bad, right? It's not like I never had that feeling of like, oh, these guys are idiots and they're ruining my picture, right? It was
Hmm.
like it was never that. I knew that they had good reasons, right? They just weren't like pictorial reasons.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, I get the need for that, but oh man, that makes it such a less like interesting picture to me. And very quickly it was sort of like, oh man, now I have to like do this thing. and
Hmm.
uh like I said, I mean, I know I have friends who don't feel that way at all, right? Who,
No, everyone's different.
love working with art directors and things like that and really like that sort of collaboration. And like I said, I found out very quickly for myself that it didn't suit my particular, uh, temperament in a way.
Yeah. The reason I asked is because I sort of landed in my senior year in college, I sort of landed in a video game industry job.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And it was a dream job, like in the sense that it was high paying,
Hmm.
at least had the potential to be. I mean, I was just
Yeah.
training when I was there, but it had I mean, there was food everywhere every day. You come and go as you please. You make your own hours. The people there were incredibly talented. They were great. They were making these great, really interesting games at the time. If you were into games, I was never into games,
Yeah.
which was part of the problem.
Yeah.
But it just wasn't for me. It just like, even though it was a fulfilling, I mean, it might have been a fulfilling job to many. It just, I felt the exact same way you did. It's like, this isn't mine. I don't
Yeah.
have any ownership
Yeah.
in this. I'm just like one gear in this big machine. So
Yeah.
I got out after about 2 months. So that's why I was curious what your
Yeah.
reasoning was for that.
Yeah, yeah, I was sort of a similar thing, and again, it wasn't really that long that I really did illustration work. I mean, it was, maybe for about a year or so, I
Mm-hmm.
had, gigs, but it was all freelance. So, it'd be a project here, a project there. And yeah, I think to me, I know, and again, I have fine artist friends who feel, differently than me too, right? I mean, who, if their gallery or whoever says, paint more of this thing, people, are really into this, they're like, yes, right.
Yeah.
And
Some
I
people
think that's
like the
great,
challenge too.
and yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that there's all different valid ways of kind of
Hmm.
approaching that. I did find for myself very much. I mean, I kind of came to realize, and I think it's one of the interesting things about painting is, you do kind of learn about yourself through doing it.
Yeah.
Is that really, really, I mean, the more and more I've thought about it, and in some ways I've almost kind of like just doubled down on this over the years, but
Yeah.
it really is. I kind of tell myself like, look, the reason I'm doing this and not doing some other thing for a living is that I want to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
Right. That really is a big part of it to me. And that idea of just kind of following your interest, following, whatever your inspiration, seeing where that takes you,
Hmm.
to me is a big part of the thing, you know.
Did you find that when you were doing commissions, illustration commissions, that you had a hard time focusing on the work as well? Or was it just, you were just weren't enjoying it?
Yeah, I mean, it could vary, depending on what it was, but yeah, I mean, definitely there was just a feeling of like, yeah, I'd rather just be doing something else,
Hmm.
you know. And I would usually have other things going, I'd have paintings of my own that I was always making, and it was
Oh,
kind
and
of
they're
like,
all
oh
reaching,
man,
they're all screaming
I'd,
out to you.
I'd so rather be painting on that than on this,
Yeah.
you know. Um,
Huh.
so, but yeah, I mean, I think too, I mean, anytime that you don't really feel excited about something, I mean, it's hard to sustain a sustained focus, on something like that. It really does become hard work, I think.
Yeah. Oh, it's so, well, for me, it's particularly hard. That's why I ask. I'm just always curious about other artists. But I, I had a few jobs. I've only had a few jobs in my life. And I kid you not, I think every boss I had thought I was mentally disabled. And they thought I would have special needs of some sort because I could not focus. I had a
Yeah.
waiter job once and I was waiting this table that had about 8 people on it. And this when I was 16. And they all gave me their order. And then all of a sudden I found myself in the kitchen. I don't know how I got there. I don't, I could vaguely remember the 8 people at the table, but I don't remember anything they said. And it
Yeah.
was as though I teleported to the kitchen. And that happened. Oh, and I had to go back there with my tail between my legs and tell them I didn't hear a word you said. And man, they just looked at me like I was the most incompetent human being on the planet.
Yeah.
But my boss eventually said to me, Jeff, I don't want to fire you, so can you just quit? And I said, okay, I'll put in my 2 weeks. He goes, no, you can go home now. It was bad. And that just kept happening. If I wasn't interested, I could not
Yeah.
focus. So
Yeah.
I tell my wife, if this whole art thing ever dies, I'm toast because I don't think
Yeah.
I'd make a good employee. I mean, I know I wouldn't. So that's why I'm curious about that. If that was ever, you seem to be a lot
Yeah.
smarter than me, though. You probably could focus on it better than I could, but
I mean, I don't know, I am, it, I think part, and I've, I had a lot of random jobs, over the years, particularly, when I was younger. And I mean, I did fine, I guess,
yeah.
Um, but I mean, in the greater scheme of things, I suppose. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think one of the real challenges of, something like that is that, if you're uninterested and you're your own boss, I
Mm-hmm.
think it is, right? I mean, it's like, well, I could work on this, or I could like,
Oh, yeah.
go to the
That's
beach. I mean, you know,
exactly.
like, and so it is. I mean, there's definitely like there was that aspect of like, I just have to force myself to sit here and do this because it's due in, a day or whatever. And,
Mm-hmm.
and it is. I mean, it's a very different experience. I mean, it's funny, this is the first time that I'm actually thinking about it in kind of a long time
Really?
because it was so long ago at this point, but it's funny just now. I mean, I'm kind of thinking about it in my brain and, comparing that to, what I do now. I mean, and, it's just painting yesterday here at my studio, and just, making paintings that I want to make. I mean, and it's like, I'm like, man, I can't wait to get to the easel, right? It's like I get there
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, oh, today's my day. I'm painting. I'm going to be at the easel for, 12, 13 hours, whatever, until, it's time to go to bed, basically, and it's such a different experience, for
Yeah.
me at least,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. No kidding. All right. So sorry to cut you off. So you ended up in Oakland at the Atelier. So tell me about that.
yeah. So like I said, I mean, at the time, I mean, I had finished art college and I kind of knew, in some ways, I mean, I sort of knew that I still wasn't really that great at painting,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I was like, well, like I went to art school. I don't know what else you do. Like, I don't know. I guess I just have to practice or something, and and I mean, yeah, there's an aspect of that for sure, but like I said, quite by accident, I just happened to find this atelier in Oakland, and and it really, I mean, I think I had never heard of an atelier or anything, or that whole world, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. These are actually people who are like kind of trying to build the same skills that I'm trying to build, and so it was great. I loved it, and I studied there at nights for a few years, and really learned a lot, and improved a lot. And then at some point when I was there, I found out about Jacob Collins and the Grand Central Atelier here in New York, and I had known Jacob's work, for a little while and was, impressed and blown away and all that by him. And then when I found out, that there was a school and he was teaching and, started seeing student work, I was like, oh, wait, like his students are all getting really good too. Like what are what are they doing out there? I'm like, I gotta
Mm-hmm.
I gotta go to New York and kind of check this out. And so I wound up, moving out to New York to study there. And I say, in a lot of ways, I think, the way I paint now, the way I kind of think about painting now is largely, rooted in kind of my studies there, really
Mm-hmm.
more than probably anything.
Was it a lot
And
different than the previous Atelier?
Very, very different.
In
Yeah.
what ways?
In a lot of ways, actually. But one of the um one of the things I say, a lot is that I think there's kind of different ways of approaching trying to put the three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional canvas, right? And previous to, I think, coming to GCA, everything that I had studied had been in sort of an optically based, you could say sort of value shapey, you could say general to specific, type of methodology. And when I came to GCA, there was all this talk about the idea of like form, right? And this word form was like thrown around all the time. And it was this word that I'd sort of never heard before when I first got there. And at heart, I mean, it's basically this idea that, you're trying to make something sculpturally sound within your image, right? You're trying to create a world sort of back behind that picture plane rather than, a series of sort of colors sort of on the picture plane. And to me, I mean, I think that's just a fundamentally different way of thinking about, picture making. Which to me, I mean, really, really quickly, looking at that, all the work that was coming out of there, and sort of getting familiar with this concept, it was sort of like this light bulb. I was like, oh, like that's why their pictures look all awesome and like mine mine don't, right? It's that they're thinking about things in this very sort of different way, and that thinking is sort of rooted in an understanding of what's actually happening up there, what's going on, how are things interacting between your objects, your light source, and really, really having kind of a conceptual, sculptural framework for what it is that you're doing.
Hmm. So I had Michael Klein on here. We talked a little bit about this.
Oh yeah,
And
Michael's great.
I find, yeah, he's great. I find it really interesting. And I'm curious your thoughts on it. I mean, I feel like my approach, I went to university and several colleges, but I wasn't trained in a traditional way like you were or Michael was. And so my approach has sort of been just picking from guys like you and Michael and various other people that I admire, and just saying, okay, they're doing this, and just sort of a modge podge of all these different approaches.
Yeah.
So that form idea is something that I like to think about as well, but I'm also very optical.
Mhm.
But a thought that I've often had is, if you do both well,
Mhm.
or you do either one well, don't you more or less end up in the same place?
Uh, I mean, I think in some ways yes, and I think in some ways no. Um, and I think that there's sort of an interesting relationship between those two things.
Yeah.
And one of the things that uh, I always say is really, that I find kind of interesting about it is that you can actually take various positions on it, and you can kind of make a case for different, very contradictory seeming ideas in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say to, my students, because I teach at the GCA now, and I teach a lot of stuff, but one of the main things I teach is cast drawing when they first get there, and where we're
Mm-hmm.
really talking about kind of the nuts and bolts of this idea. And I always say I think that you can take the position that form thinking and optical thinking are two completely different ways of approaching making a picture, and that they never meet because they're fundamentally, different, right? And in some ways, I think that that's true. I think that you can also take the position that in the end, they're actually exactly the same thing, uh, if you fully understand either of them or both of
Yeah,
them,
that would be
right?
my position.
And
Yeah.
in some ways, I think that that's also true, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think you can also similarly take the position that uh, people are picking one method or the other in terms of framing their thinking about picture
Mm-hmm.
making. Again, right, the separate kind of school of thought.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that you can take the position that every single person is actually using both all the time
Mm-hmm.
to one degree or another. It's just that we have one thing maybe dialed up and one thing dialed down in varying proportions depending on our who we are, right?
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways that's also true, right? That I don't think the thing that I think is difficult to make a case for is actually those two opposing ideas not simultaneously being true, if that makes sense.
Not, yes, it does make sense.
Right.
Yeah. So I would definitely be in the camp that they're both true and that they work together to the same ends. That would be my perspective. But it's I find that if a student does not think about form, what seems to happen is they miss the optical information
Yeah.
oftentimes, right?
Mhm.
It's like they just don't see it. because it's too subtle and they just don't see well enough. So thinking about the form is just a way of reminding them, wait a minute, you forgot something there. That halftone gets a little darker here because the form moves away from the light slightly, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that the way you would look at it as well?
I think that's a fair description. And yeah, I mean, an analogy that I use a lot, I think, is, a really solid understanding of form is kind of like a really solid understanding of anatomy,
Yeah,
right?
that's what Michael said too. Mm-hmm.
That, one example that I always give is, if you know, even, sort of, kind of a basic level of anatomy, you'll know that a particular muscle has to connect to a certain spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you know that, you're never really going to get that wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like if it has to connect right at the pit of the neck, you're never going to accidentally make it connect to the shoulder because you just know
Yeah.
that it needs to go there, right? But if you go to any, figure drawing class in like an art college, you're going to see that muscle connecting all over the place because
Right.
if you don't have that piece of information in your head and know that that's what needs to happen, it's actually amazingly easy to get that wrong because the model shifts around a little bit and you look at the angle of something at an inopportune moment in the pose, and what feels like a really accurate observation pulls you completely off base of where you need to be, right?
Right.
So in a way you can think about it, I sometimes describe it as a way of organizing information so that the whole makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Where I think if we're and you can take extremes in some ways, right? That in sort of the same way, right? If we're purely optical, right, and we're purely making, sort of individual optical observations, right? If we like, and in some schools of thought, you'll hear this kind of advocated for, that it's almost like you're shutting off your brain and trying to become this sort of blank, like seeing machine,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And you'll hear pieces of advice. Like one of the classic ones I always used to get in art college was, you'd be told, draw what you see and not what you know, right?
Right.
And it felt very much like this, like turn off your thoughts and just look, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a training context, I think there's a certain utilitarian purpose to that because it is building up certain skills that aren't maybe natural to us at first, right? But I think as an end goal, I think it's maybe not entirely ideal, right?
Right.
And I think one of the potential downfalls to thinking in these sort of individual optical observations only is that things can become disjointed very, very quickly, right? That the whole cannot add up to make sense, right? Just like if you're not
Mm-hmm.
understanding the anatomy and you're just saying, well, if I just look at the figure and draw what I see, it should be fine. I don't really need to know anatomy, right? And you'd kind of
Mm-hmm.
say like, well, in theory, you could kind of say that, but in practice, it doesn't tend to work out that well, right?
Yeah. Especially if you're
Um,
working from life.
yeah,
Yeah, because the light shifts. The model moves a millimeter, and all of a sudden, the cast shadow from the
yeah,
breast, for example, completely changes shape.
right,
And so, if you don't
right,
understand, then you've got this like Picasso-esque Mod
right.
Podge of different positions
Yeah,
because you're
yeah,
blindly obeying optical observations instead of your,
absolutely.
yeah.
Right. Then, you could take it to the other extreme too, right? And you could say, for example, well, okay, well, what if I completely throw out the optical, right? What if I completely say, like, well, I'm not going to look at anything. I don't need that. I'm just going to be 100%, conceptual over here, right? Well, you could sort of imagine, right, that, if similarly, right, if you use anatomy as kind of a comparison, right? Um, if you know anatomy really pretty well, like, I mean, you can draw a pretty convincing figure out of your head, right? I mean, much
Mm-hmm.
more so than somebody who doesn't know as much anatomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to me, I mean, I think the downside to that is they're going to tend to be a little generic, right? You're going to
Right.
kind of tend to draw the same sort of like Ecorche looking comic booky guy, like over
Mm-hmm.
and over again, right? They're not going to have the particularities of, what you might see if you have an actual model in front of you, right? But if you take those two together, right, I mean, there's like a Goldilocks spot kind of in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
right, where you're kind of getting the best of both worlds in some ways, right? You can come to that model with a body of knowledge that tells you, okay, this is what I need to be looking for. This is what I understand about a figure. And now I'm going to look at this specific person to fill in all the particularities, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the problems I find with being completely conceptual, you've sort of alluded to this already, is that I don't know that it's possible to understand light and form so well that you can truly make a convincing and absolutely convincing figure without seeing. Because
Yeah.
I mean, the face, the way it turns away on the sides, you got a shadow casting across the cheek. How the heck do you know how long to make that thing? You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
it just seems impossible to know it that well. So
Yeah.
to me, that's why the marriage of the two is so
Yeah.
important. One of the things you said earlier about this kind of turning off your brain. It's funny you say that because I've said that many times. I've called the lizard brain.
Mhm.
And this the thing you also, what was it? How'd you put it? Paint what you see, not what you know. Right? I heard
Yeah.
that in school all the time. The
Yeah.
problem is that makes perfect sense when your students are all completely ignorant because what they know is wrong.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Absolutely.
stop painting what you think you know because you know
Yeah.
nothing.
Absolutely.
Right. And then at
Right.
some point they know, and then at some point you teach them things. And then it's like,
Yeah.
okay, now start painting what you know
Yeah.
because now you actually have something to offer.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that I always say, right, is that like if if this is ultimately uh best achieved, right, by
Yeah.
kind of a collaboration between optical observation and intellectual knowledge. Exactly, right? I mean, at first, like we just don't know much, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like we've got this like really ignorant guy inside of our head, telling us what to do, right? Uh, I would always advocate, I mean, I think that the solution isn't to not have knowledge, right? The
Right. Of
solution
course
is,
not.
well, like know better stuff, right?
Right.
Learn better stuff so that your knowledge is now like more robust and more helpful, right? And I think ideally that's where, schools and teachers come in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is to kind of like give us better information in some ways, right? Better ways of thinking about these things, right? And because in some ways I think we're always drawing a combination of what we're seeing and whatever our mental model of that thing is, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's unavoidable in some ways, right? And I think a lot of learning to draw and paint, yes, a good portion of it is learning to observe, right? But a large part of it too is essentially building better mental models of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the an example I use a lot is at some point when we were all little kids, when we were 4 or 5 or something, when we would take a crayon and draw a face, right? Our mental model of an eye was kind of like a dot, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you have the circle for the head and two dots for the eyes and maybe a line for a mouth, right? And that's sort of the extent of our mental model at that point in our lives, right? And at some point, we get a little older and maybe that eye develops into like a circle with a dot in it, sort of like a
Yeah.
matte graining style kind of
Mm-hmm.
eye, right? And there again, we get a little further along and we get, maybe to be about 11 or 12 or so. And we draw, I call it the football eye, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of shaped like a football with a circle inside of it for the iris and maybe a pupil if you want. And then, maybe there's some like big eyelashes that kind of stick out at the
Yeah.
top, right? And we said it, I mentioned earlier, right, that usually that's around the point where most people stop drawing, right? And if you ask most grown-ups, to draw an eye, that's the eye that they draw. It's the 12-year-old football eye,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of where their mental models stopped growing, right? Now, if they are an artist or they took some drawing classes or went to art school or something, your mental model keeps evolving, right? You start to understand, like, oh yeah, there's an eyelid that wraps around the sphere of the eyeball that sort of has this fold that does this. And well, I don't really see a bunch of individual eyelashes sticking out like, tarantula legs, right? Um, and those models sort of develop, right, and they evolve with us, and that's a big part of why our drawings get better. you know
Mm-hmm. Hmm. All right. So Grand Central Academy offered this new concept to you. What else did you get from it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that was, I mean, that's a pretty big one for me. But I always say one of the things that also I found really helpful about going there, and I always say I think this one sounds really silly, but but it's actually pretty true for me at least, is that one of the things I really found helpful about studying there was actually just the idea that things happen for a reason, right? And that
Hmm.
you can actually like trace that back to like, oh, this is happening because of this, right? That like, okay, this is getting some light bouncing up off of here, and that's why we're getting this color in, this area, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where for me at least, in my experience, like, I mean, all through college, I mean, even largely through my first atelier, there was this idea that you'd sort of do something and your teachers would come around and they'd say something like, well, that just needs to be redder, right? Or they'd say, well, that just needs to be darker, right?
Without a
And
why. They don't
without a
tell you why.
why,
Yeah.
right? And so you were kind of left in this position where, and the other thing they talk about a lot is this idea that you're training your eyes, right? It's another one of those expressions that I'm always a little, kind of wary of in a way. Um, but you were sort of left in this position in a lot of ways where you just say like, oh yeah, okay, I guess it does need to get redder or darker or whatever. And you would just kind of hope that, like, I don't know, maybe someday if I stare long enough and hard enough, like my eyes will sort of be as good as my teachers somehow,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And sometimes, I mean, certainly this wasn't the case for, everybody, but I mean, sometimes I don't know that the teachers were even really any better at spotting things than we were. It was just, it wasn't their painting, and it's kind of easy to go to somebody else's painting and find a problem with
Right.
it, But I think there wasn't, right? There wasn't ever really much in my experience in terms of like, oh, this is happening because of this, and there's a concept here that you can understand and can be explained and is going to repeat in other scenarios. So pay attention to this because you're going to run into this a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
That to me was always kind of left out a little bit, right? And
Hmm.
so when I came to GCA, even just the idea that, like, oh, we can actually investigate this sort of like a detective and figure out what's going on in here. And understanding that better is going to help us depict it more easily, right? Was actually a pretty big change for me. And it's something that I mean, I advocate so much now. I mean, to all my students is really get in and investigate, right? Figure out what's going on in there, why that's happening, right? That
Mm-hmm.
there are these concepts, and light behaves in pretty predictable ways, right? That you're gonna, I always tell them, I mean, you're gonna run into the same handful of ideas in varying, combinations and permutations, I mean, kind of forever, right?
Right.
So it's like if you can really get a good grasp on kind of a handful of foundational ideas, it actually goes like a really long way in terms of helping us to understand things.
Hmm. Do you ever get students that aren't interested in the understanding they just want a formula?
I have had students like that. I mean, or, over the years, for sure. Um, I think that they're usually, somewhat in the minority. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
not a ton, but from time to time it happens. And um, I think, in some ways, different people have different goals, right?
Right.
I think if somebody doesn't want to kind of dive, relatively deep into understanding the nuts and bolts of things, I always say in some ways I'm just probably not the teacher they're going to gravitate to for
Right.
very long.
Right.
I
They're going to
mean,
get real frustrated.
because because there are I mean, there's no shortage of instructors that'll give a 3 or 4 word trick, right?
Right.
Of dubious, sort of usefulness. There's plenty of that out there, and I think if that's really what somebody wants, I mean, they'll probably go find it because it's not that hard to find.
Yeah.
Um, you know, um, and but for the most part, I mean, I think in some ways too, I mean, I think probably GCA has a bit of a reputation for, kind of diving into these things.
Right. So
I
you're
mean,
not
I
going to
think
attract them.
for the most part, I mean, every now and again, maybe there's an exception, but usually for the most part, I think, and I think this is more and more true that I think people sort of know what they're getting into. I mean, when they
Hmm.
come, so, but yeah, I mean, I've definitely had that experience.
Yeah. The reason I ask is because I have had that. It is rare for me as well.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of one student many years ago who was a math teacher, or she
Oh.
might have even been a professor. I mean, very,
Yeah.
very intelligent person.
Yeah.
And much like, I'm speculating on to some degree as to why, but I think many of us have, not only do we have different goals, but we have different ways of learning and applying knowledge too.
Mhm.
So we're not all programmed the same way. And for her, I felt like what she wanted, with her art, was what she got from her math. And her math, it's for her, it was like, when this happens, plug in this formula,
Yeah.
and divide
Right.
by the numerator, blah, 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 blah. Like, follow these steps and you will get a result.
Yeah.
Right. And then when she showed up to study with me, it was like, okay, what steps
Yeah.
do I need to take to have success? And it was this constant battle. Like, no, there are no steps. Like, there are no steps. I'm trying to get you to understand principles here.
Yeah.
She's like, I just want to know the steps. What do I got to do? A,
Yeah.
B, C, D. And it was interesting. Eventually, she broke through it. But
Yeah.
but it was interesting. I mean, we're all programmed a little bit differently. So that's why I was curious about that. If you've ever run into that.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. I mean, and I think there's a whole spectrum,
Yeah.
um, uh, because I do actually, I mean, for the most part, start people at least pretty like step by step in a way,
Well, again, they have no knowledge, right? At that
and
point.
yeah, and a former student of mine just reminded me of this story not that long ago. I had totally forgotten about it. Uh, on the first day in class, I did a demo and I kind of talked through, okay, do this first and then this and then this and she told me recently, she says, I don't know if you remember this, on the first day you laid out all this stuff, you did this demo and told us what to do, and then when you were all done, I asked you, do we have to do it that way?
Really?
And apparently my recommendation was something along the lines of like, well, I would recommend it.
That was the point of the demo.
But she went through the whole core program. I mean, she was like a really great student actually, and a pleasure to work with. Like I said, we both kind of had a good laugh over it, when she reminded me of this story that I don't even remember.
That's
But
funny.
I think that there is, there's all different starting places, that people have, and different ways of kind of navigating through the journey in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This episode is brought to you in part by Rosemary Brushes. If you're one of my listeners who's a professional artist, you're already using Rosemary Brushes. But for the rest of you, come on. Take your work a little more seriously. Stop buying the other brands. It's just not worth it. Every now and then you may get lucky and buy a good brush from another brand, but use the brand that professionals like myself are using. Go to rosemaryandco.com, link in the description or the show notes, and get yourself some quality brushes before your next painting.
So what happened after Grand Central when you finished up there? What was next?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I've stayed in New York. I kind of became an instructor there, so I've been teaching there for a while now, as well as making obviously my own paintings. And pretty much that's what I've been up to ever since, is painting and teaching here in New York.
Okay. So did you stay in New York in order to teach there? Because I'm always curious.
Yeah.
I grew up in Newburgh, New York, which is about an hour north of the city.
Oh yeah, I know exactly where it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's actually New Windsor I grew up in, but most people don't know New Windsor. But
Okay.
anyway, and I often think, like, why would an artist live in New York? It's so freaking expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've thought about it.
It's occurred to me,
I mean, I can see the draw of it. You got the Met and all these other great museums. You got the culture and everything else. But as a self-employed artist, it's like, gosh, man, you got a lot of bills to pay there. It's big bills to pay.
Yeah. I sort of joke about that, because I know so many people who over the years now have come to New York for a while to, oftentimes study at GCA, and then they say something to the effect of, well, I'm going to stick around for a couple years afterwards, and then I'm going to go back to wherever, they're from, and, where it's cheaper. And I always kind of kid that, I'm from San
Yeah, well, you
Francisco.
can't go to San Francisco.
And I'm like, I'm, going back is like what, to the one place that's more expensive than New York.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
But no, I do think about that definitely from time to time of, like, I don't know, would it make more sense to be, somewhere else, or, and it's not something I know people who are like, New York or die. This is it. This is the only place I want to be. And I don't know. I've never particularly felt that way. I mean, I like New York, but I could also see myself being in, other places. I mean, I have a feeling probably at some point in I would be surprised if I lived in New York for the rest of my life. I mean, maybe I'll be surprised, but
Yeah.
I think at some point probably I'll wind up somewhere. Who knows?
Yeah, I am envious that the Met is so accessible to you. That museum is
That part's pretty nice.
pretty freaking awesome. Yeah, we've got nothing even close to it in Salt Lake City, which is unfortunate. But yeah, we'll enjoy it while you're there.
Yeah.
It's a great place to be. All right, so you're a full-time painter, well, part-time painter, part-time, let's just say full-time painter, full-time teacher. That's really what it amounts to for painters and teachers.
Yeah.
You're kind of full-time everything.
Yeah.
So how did you go from painting the figure and cast drawing and so on to this still life that involves birds? And I mean, your subject matter is really cool.
Oh, thanks.
And it's really different. I mean, I can see Grand Central Academy in your approach, but your subject matter is really different. And I'm just curious how you arrived at that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it's kind of a combination of a lot of things. And I think about it kind of, depending on how far back you go. I mean, when I was a kid, I mean, I just used to draw animals all the time. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking about that the other night. And it's funny. It's another one of those things you don't think about it for, 30 years, and then it pops into your head for whatever reason that, I remember as a kid, just getting, there was those little like how to draw books. And I remember those
Mm-hmm.
one of all the different breeds of dogs, and you could learn how to draw a Samoyed and a
I've still
Boston
got some of those
Terrier and
books. I
yeah,
still have them. Yep.
they were great. And you'd start with like a couple circles, and then, at the end, somehow they just like turned into a dog, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I remember like in elementary school, I mean, just every week we would go to the school library and you could check out a book, and I'd just get the same book every week, like the How to Draw Dogs book. And and then I mean, I remember later on there were, some books of like, some of those Dover like um, sort of copyright free old engravings, books, where it'd just be animals and, same thing. I mean, I would just draw from those books all the time as a kid. And then in college, I got really interested in wildlife art for a while. And particularly there was a artist I really liked a lot. I still think is pretty great. A guy named Ray Harris Ching, is from New Zealand, and mostly paints birds, but he paints other stuff too. But you know, for a little while, I was, kind of like searching around, sort of for I don't know, you could say like a community, I guess, because
Mm-hmm.
in college, I mean, what I wanted to do felt so at odds with what everything that was happening there was, that, it was always kind of this like, okay, I'm this weirdo over in the corner, painting this
Mm-hmm.
this portrait or whatever, and and everybody else wanted to be, Jackson Pollock or something like that. And so, for a little while, I was like, oh, and wildlife art, that's kind of interesting. There's this kind of like little sub world of people doing this. Like, well, man, maybe I kind of fit in here. I like painting animals, and sort of followed, that world for a little while. But um, you know, honestly, when I really got interested in still life was at my first atelier in Oakland. And our teacher there had a really what I still think is a very pragmatic approach to teaching in some ways, which is, he said, look, we're just working on foundational concepts, and learning skills. You don't need to pay a model to be up in front of you. Just put an apple and a cup, and, they had this big sort of corner of the room with all these still life objects you could just kind of grab from, and you'd set something up and draw it or paint it. And that was basically the whole school was pretty much still life. And so, I started doing it, not particularly thinking that I would be a still life painter or anything, but just to kind of learn some skills, and it seemed like a good way to do that. And in sort of the process of that, I started looking at more still life painting in, sort of maybe more intensive ways than I had before, and started actually finding it really interesting. And then, started kind of being more and more interested in kind of doing that. When I came to GCA at first, I still kind of had the idea that, maybe I was gonna kind of paint the figure, but actually relatively quickly, I mean, a couple of years in, I really just found that, like, when I was actually thinking about like, well, what do I want to paint? Like, what kind of pictures do I want to make? What ideas am I coming up with for paintings? I just kind of felt that like none of them really included figures in them.
Hmm.
That it just wasn't kind of the thing that was really like popping up in my mind as far as things that I wanted to paint. And wasn't like I sat down and said, I'm not going to paint the figure anymore or anything like that. It just kind of didn't seem to be working itself into the ideas that I had. And, mentioned earlier, I mean, I think I'm definitely a big, believer in that idea of kind of just following the path of wherever your interests take you, and so I just kind of found that was where I wound up sort of going, and then from there, I mean, it did. I mean, I think the birds and things kind of started working their way back in, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's right. I always just kind of really liked drawing and painting animals, actually. And
Hmm.
at the moment, I haven't really posted posted much of it yet, but at the moment, I've been painting all these fish and things like that, and
Oh,
it's
I didn't
been
post one of
really
those on the
really.
slideshow. Yeah.
I haven't posted a lot of them.
Well, I
They're
saw a
mostly
pink fish.
there's that one that I shared from a little while back, but I've been doing a lot more and various different fish and eels, and I've sort of been on a marine life kick
But you're
lately.
only working from
Uh,
life. My understanding
yeah,
is you're only working from life. So you
definitely.
got a stinky studio right now.
So some days more than others,
That would
but
be rough, man.
it's all from life. That I don't. I mean, just as a policy, don't ever paint from photos or AI or anything like that.
Wait, don't skim over
So
that. That's an interesting topic. So why?
yeah,
Well, I mean, I
yeah,
can understand why. I'm just curious what your feelings are.
yeah. I um, it just doesn't. And again, I mean, I'll give kind of the simple answer first, and then I'll maybe kind of elaborate. But um, i- in all honesty, I mean, the main reason is just that I don't like it.
Yeah.
It's that I just don't really enjoy doing it. And one way that I really think about it is, I've had this, just fascination for a long time with, old paintings, and the painters who I really love, and who I'm really just constantly inspired by are, they're the old, like, Dutch, Flemish, sort of Baroque and earlier, and not that there's not lots of other stuff I look at too, but those as a broad kind of group, I mean, I always just come back to, and is really just, I'm like, oh, this is just really, really the stuff that I love. And anytime I see it, I just get inspired, and it's a really kind of nourishing, I think, art
Hmm.
viewing experience. And there's all these painters, that are painting these fantastic things. I mean, you look at, somebody like Rachel Roish, who paints, all these, florals. I mean, you look at somebody like Franz Snyder's, who paints all these great animals. You look at somebody like Paul DeVos, who's painting, these dogs fighting with deer, and all these great scenes, right? And and they're just these phenomenally kind of realized visions that they're putting on the canvas, and all of it was from before photography, right? Like, none of those guys were painting from photographs, right? I mean, it's like hundreds of years before the idea was even invented, right?
Hmm.
And and so, to me, I think so often the rationale I hear for painting from photos is that, well, if you wanted to paint this, you'd have to do it from a
No,
photo,
that's
right?
ridiculous.
Like,
Yeah.
if you wanted to paint a wave, an ocean, you'd have to do it from a photo. If you wanted to paint an animal, you'd have to. If you wanted to paint a kid, you'd have to use it. And I'm like, well, there were these amazing paintings of all those things from before there were ever photos, right? I mean, so clearly it can be done, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that, to me, I mean, well, it's like, well, okay, how, right? How was that done, right? And it's like, well, first off, they had to have some kind of an understanding of their subject, right? That they had to sort of understand how a wave moves, right? How an animal moves, when it's, jumping around, right?
Hmm.
Whatever it is. But then also they'd have to be really decisive, right? That if you're painting that, if you're, Rachel Roish painting this, flower, I mean, to this like just fantastic level of finish, she didn't have it sitting there for, weeks and weeks so that she could noodle with it, right? She had to be super, super decisive when it came to actually, what she was doing. And to me, that's actually a part of the thing, right? Is like developing that understanding, right? Working with these things, being decisive to say, okay, I'm going to bring this fish, for example, into my studio, and I've got one day, right? I've got one day to do what I'm going to do with this fish, and then that's it, right? Then it's gone, right? Um, to me is a really, I think, enjoyable challenge. And I think that as you start kind of working in that way, I think in some ways it informs you in terms of like, well, okay, like why do those paintings look the way that they did, right? Because the limitations are a part of that in a way, And the analogy that I always kind of give is, if somebody really loved like ragtime piano, right, and was listening to like, Scott Joplin and all these guys, right? Um, but then said like, well, yeah, but that's like really hard. Like you have to be able to play with both hands and like really fast, and it's like really complicated. And like there's a tendency, I think, that people have to say something to the effect of like, well, what if I just play the right hand part and I'm going to play it at like half speed because that's kind of easier. And then I'm going to take that, I'm going to put it into GarageBand and I'm going to double the speed so it sounds like I'm playing really fast, right? And then
Hmm.
separately I can play the left hand part, right, at half speed because I can kind of do that on its own. And then I'll put that in the computer and I'll splice them together, double the speed, and it'll kind of sound like I'm playing like, Scott Joplin, right? And it might, right? It might kind of sound like you're playing like him. But like, are you really like a ragtime piano player? I don't know. To me, not really, right? I think that you're fundamentally at that point doing a very different thing. Now, you can make an argument, a perfectly, perfectly valid argument for that thing, right?
Right.
That you're saying, yes, I'm doing a different thing, and there's some resemblance to this other thing that, that I'm really, interested in and love. Um, but to me personally, I'm much more interested in saying, well, okay, but like if I really wanted to just play the piano like them, let me just forget all that, right? Let me
Yeah.
not go down that rabbit hole of learning GarageBand and like splicing things together and changing the tempo and everything. Let me instead just really, really focus on the piano, right? Because I think that so much of the time there's the sort of almost a default assumption, right? That people have that like, oh, well, you'd kind of have to use a photo, right? And I said, well, not really, right? And I think when you make that sort of counter argument, inevitably the response that you kind of get is like, well, yeah, but I mean, you'd have to be like really good at painting to do that, right? And you're like,
Heaven
well,
forbid.
yeah, right?
Yeah.
But like, well, that's the thing that I'm interested in trying to do, though, right? Is to like be really good at painting, right?
Yeah.
And to me, the path there is focusing there, right? And I remember a story once that there was a student at GCA in the figure room who, they were doing a figure painting, and the pose was about to be over, and they said something to Jacob. They were kind of melting down, I think, a little bit. And they're like, Jacob, we need more time. I don't have enough time to finish my painting. Like, I can't, there's so many things that I still need to do. There's not enough time. And he said something to the effect of, he's like, you don't. He's like, you don't need more time. You just need to be better at painting.
Oh, snap.
Right. And,
Yeah.
and but you know, but it's true, right? And like I think he elaborated, but I mean, ultimately his point that he, kind of was I mean, explained in more detail was basically like, look, you've painted the whole figure, right? Like you got through all of it. You had time to make all these decisions. It's just that you're not 100% happy with those decisions you made. And so now you feel like you have to do it again, right? Like you painted a complete figure, right? So if those first decisions were just better, right, you'd have a painting you'd be happy with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point was do it again, right, with another figure, right? New model, new painting, new everything, and then do it again, and then do it again. Keep practicing making those decisions, right? And as you do, right, your decisions are going to get better, right? So that when you do make those first decisions, right, they're going to be decisions that you feel good about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're not going to need all the extra time, right? You're going to have this figure in like actually way less time than you thought possible, right? And that's the thing to me. I mean, if I'm painting a flower or I'm painting a fish or something like that, it is, right? It's like, okay, today's the day, right? I'm going to get in, I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do. And then at the end of the day, well, for better or worse, those are the decisions that I made, right? Those were a record of me in that moment doing my best, right?
Yeah.
And then from there, I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to keep moving forward, right?
But
And
what if
and
you could do better with the technology, with this technology, photography, AI? What if you could make better work?
well, I think that's a big if because it would depend on your definition of better,
Mm-hmm.
right? My tendency is to think that it wouldn't actually be better,
And
right?
why is that?
Uh, well, I think for a number of reasons, right? But the first thing that I'd have to say is like, well, how would it be better,
Are you
right?
asking me, or is that rhetorical?
Well, well, I mean, it could it could go either way, I guess.
I don't know.
But
But I have seen artists' work improve dramatically with using AI. Now, let me just put this out here, right? Just so you know where I'm coming from, because it
yeah,
might change the tone of the conversation.
mhm,
I'm with you 100%. Like I worked from life exclusively for 14 years. And the only reason
mhm,
I started implementing photography is because I've got this project that I'm going to die before I finish it unless I speed it up.
mhm,
So at some point I had to abandon everything you're saying
mhm,
because I'm with you 100% and compromise in order to get this project done.
yeah,
So just so you understand, I'm just sort of digging because I'm curious on how much we do agree on this. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. But I have seen artists that, frankly, it's a little frustrating because AI is where I'll draw the line, absolutely,
yeah,
where their work is just extraordinarily better once they start applying AI. And it's just, I mean, I'm not going to give you names because that would be
yeah,
unfair, right? But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that to your clients, those who buy your work, to your dealers, to all the people that matter to your success as an artist, they all agree that by applying some technology, your work would get better. Maybe you don't agree, but they do, just for the sake
yeah.
of argument.
Mhm.
Then what? What if that were the case? Would you still value working from life enough to continue to work from life?
Um, I think I would. And I think it kind of comes full circle back to, talking about illustration earlier, which is uh, that if I'm not interested in the process, I have a very hard time actually like doing anything.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I probably would actually be the stubborn guy in some ways
Yeah.
who says like, no, I just don't want to do that because it's not what I want to do. Um, uh, Again, I mean, to me, I think it would be really hard for me to agree with the initial premise. And I know it's a hypothetical premise, but it would be really hard for me to agree with the premise that that would make it better. And to me, I think, and I noticed this kind of a lot in even going to museums, actually, that there's like this certain point, and I notice this with a lot of things actually, but specifically with paintings, um, there's this point where you can kind of go through a museum like, and lots of times it's sort of roughly chronological, and you'll sort of start off with like kind of pre-Renaissance, stuff, and they're these little paintings like from, it's like before the perspective and stuff had been worked out, and there's like these saints battling demons and things like that, and they're all these like really, really great, like quirky little paintings, right? They're just, I mean, they've got those like the scrolls floating through the air that say stuff on them, and like they're just these like fabulously bizarre images, and they're great. Like I love them. I could just spend forever looking at those. And then you get a little further along and you start getting into the Baroque stuff, right? And I'm just like, oh, this stuff's great. This is like my Goldilocks spot in art history. Like I love it, right?
Yeah.
And then you get a little further along, right? I mean, you get into, some of the, later, Rococo and Mannerism and all these things. And it's like really great. You get these like Fragonards and Boucher and all these things. And and same thing, right? There's just this like sort of bizarre otherworldly space that's being created behind these canvases. And even into the early 19th century, you look and it's just like all these really phenomenal things. And then this weird thing happens kind of in the middle of the 19th century where like all of a sudden I just find myself getting phenomenally bored in the galleries.
The
And
paintings are too naturalistic at that point.
like I don't know that I would even say naturalistic is the word that I would use necessarily, but it feels like all the sort of magic and all the life kind of gets sucked out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And
All the humanity in a
it
way.
just starts becoming phenomenally dull. And I always kind of like, and it's only really been in maybe the last handful of years that I've put this together for myself, because I always used to, you'd hear the sort of like dominant narrative of art history that you'd get in like art colleges and stuff, right? That there was like sort of representational painting, and then it was like awful, and then the Impressionists came and they freed us all and made way for Picasso, right? And he was like the savior of art or something like that, right? That you get in art college, and I always really bristled against that because I was always like, well, I don't know, geez, I don't really even love any of that painting. I really like the stuff that came before,
Mm-hmm.
and and it was only until maybe, I don't know, the last half dozen years or so that I started actually really paying a lot of attention to things from the 19th century, and suddenly had this moment of like, oh my God, wait, like I don't like this. Right? I like all the stuff, the sort of pre-impressionist stuff that I thought was sort of on like my team. you
Mm-hmm.
know I'm like, oh wait, actually I kind of get why people started bristling against this. Like it actually, I'm not that crazy about it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And even certain things in the Met, that will walk through, and you can sort of see like, oh yeah, no, this is really when photography got invented, right? That everything kind of takes this weird turn, and all of a sudden, like the drawing feels very strangely accurate, but like the light effect feels kind of like flat. And you're like, wait, what happened here? You went from like all this really great stuff to this sort of like dead thing, right? Um, it's a little bit not that anybody, of course, has to have the same taste as me, but it's a little bit the same way I felt about, kind of popular music, that I've always kind of just listened to older stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
I've always kind of had this weird feeling growing up that I was like, something happened in the late 70s. And like music just started sounding weird to me, right? And it wasn't till a lot later that I kind of realized, I was like, oh, it was synthesizers. Everything started being done with synthesizers, and music started sounding on the whole really, really different to when it was being made with guitars and pianos and drums and things, right? And I was like, yeah. Now, again, right, people can like whatever music they like, obviously. But to me, I was like, man, it really started sounding different, and like not in a way that I personally loved, right? Same thing with kind of painting, around that time period. I was like, man, all of a sudden, like painting started looking a way that I don't personally love.
Mm.
And so,
I've been doing Jeff's online mentorship program for about a year now, and it is awesome. Everything is online, super streamlined. If you can be there, I mean, you have the ability to talk to him once a week and he can review your work and help you. If you can't be there, it's pre-recorded. You can go back and even re-watch things if you missed something during class or couldn't be there. So the online portion of it is almost better than real life because you can always go back to it, which is awesome. The demos are recorded. It's just like all available whenever you need it. And I'm a stay-at-home mom of 4, and my time is limited, and it's also very interrupted. And so to be able to go back has been clutch for me. And you get to work with Jeff HEIN, who's awesome. He's tough. The assignments are simple, but difficult, and they're difficult to make us all better. And he's able to give us these assignments, coach us through it, help us stay excited to progress. And so it's just been a great experience. I am so grateful that he has been willing to take time away from his own art to offer all of us to have it. So if you're thinking about doing it, it's amazing.
To learn more about how you could have me as a personal mentor, check out the link to HEINatelier.com in the show notes or video description.
Are there no 19th century painters that use photography that you admire? I mean, like, what about like Waterhouse or Eakins or?
So, again, like admire, I mean, is a maybe complicated term in some ways. I mean, there's painters who I recognize as being highly skilled, right? Who like I have respect for, who like I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, those guys were bad painters, right? What I will say is that like I don't have personally the same love for that work that I have for certain things that came earlier and were made in different ways, right?
Okay.
And we were just having I was just talking to some of the students at GCA about this just a few weeks back, actually, and because one of them asked me if Bouguereau was one of my favorite artists, and it's always sort of a weird thing to explain, right? Because my honest answer is no, he's not really one of my favorite artists, actually. I have an immense amount of respect for him. I think he was incredibly skilled, right? I think a super brilliant, talented person. Do I admire his technique? 100%, right? Is he one of the guys that really, really gets me excited, who I just like absolutely love looking at and would travel to go see and gets me wanting to paint? Personally, not really. Right, he's not really one of my guys so
much. Did Bouguereau use
right?
photography?
I don't know. I mean,
I thought he
may
might
have.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm not a Bouguereau expert particularly. But he may have at times. I'm not sure. But again, I mean, there's a lot of people, or another example who I really who I do think is really, somebody who I really, really, love and admire, and is Rosa Bonheur, right? I mean, I think who's
Oh,
just a
we did a podcast on her.
fabulous painter, right? And I was talking with I don't know if you know Greg Mortensen or not,
Yeah, he's a
from
friend. Yeah.
GCA. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great guy, right? Great painter. He had just been to France and saw this big Rosa Bonheur show that was up there, and he brought back the catalog, from the show, and um, it was all in French, so we couldn't read it, but we were like, he brought it into school, and we were looking at the pictures, together, because we both really like her a lot. And she's a really interesting case because early in her career, she straddled time-wise the invention of photography, right? So her early works were before photography existed. And then during, midway through her life, it got invented. And then later on, she started taking photos and being interested in photography and all this stuff. And there's these examples where, she'd take a photo and she'd just like draw right on top of the photo and, do all these things. And we were looking through the catalog and at all these images, and it was really interesting because we both had the same take on it, which was like we were looking at some of the ones that she had done, directly off of photos and stuff, and both of us said, like, man, like that pose of that horse is so much more awkward than if she had designed it herself, right?
Mm.
Because you look at her earlier work where she had to design everything, had to invent the poses, had to come up with all these things, based on her knowledge, and they were phenomenal, right? I mean, they were so good. And then later on, I think the photography, the photographically based pictures, they kind of lose, to me, a lot of the magic that the earlier ones had, really. Because it is all of a sudden like this camera is like making all these decisions, right?
Yeah.
And
But the problem with this example, though, all these examples in my mind are that you're talking about master painters versus master painters, right? Master painters pre-camera, master painters post-camera.
Yeah.
And I would agree with you, to a master painter, the camera is either not going to make a difference at all, or it could potentially make the painting less interesting.
Yeah.
But we don't live in a world full of master painters. We live in a world full of predominantly amateur painters, and there's a lot of master painters out there. I'm not saying there's not. I mean, all 120 guests on my podcast are master painters, in my opinion. But what I mean is there's a lot of art being made out there, and a lot of people, to go back to our earlier conversation, don't have the knowledge, right? They're still kind of artistically ignorant. But today with AI and photography, it's so easy for people to sort of jump over the training or jump past the training and right ahead to the art making by using these tools. So when I say that an artist has the option of making better art, I'm not necessarily talking about the masters. I mean, the Rosa Bonheur or the, Eakins or the whoever. I'm talking about just regular people, right? And I've seen it. I mean, I've seen people struggle in model sessions and then to get a portrait right, and then they take a picture of it. And with the technology of cameras today, the photos are so good. And then they do it from a photo and it's like, oh, wow, that's beautiful. It's like,
yeah.
But they can't do it from life. They're completely incapable because they just can't keep up with the subtle movements. They don't have the drawing skills. So it's it's a bigger question, right? Let's say you were not a master painter, and you may not define yourself that way. I'm going to define you that way. Let's say you're not a master painter. It's true. And you could look like a master painter to the rest of the world, or at least closer to it, by implementing photography or AI. And these are the examples I'm talking about. When I say I see someone on Instagram whose work just exploded and became so much better, I'm not talking about the greats. I'm talking about a mediocre painter who discovered AI and now they're a great painter or a good painter. Or at least they appear to be. They appear to be. They're not. They appear to be on Instagram.
I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, it is. Very important distinction, right? So they appear to be on Instagram. Their work looks much more professional now.
Yeah.
If you were in that position, I'm saying, would you still reject photography? If you were in a position where you can't quite yet make great art, would you then resort back to photography in order to boost you ahead?
Well,
And if
I mean,
if not, I'm curious of why.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the premise of the question is tricky in that I think it assumes that whatever state of ability we're all in is somewhat inherent to us. And
Oh, no.
now,
Let me
like,
rephrase the
not
question.
that long ago, one could argue, I mean, I was a much less good painter than I am now, and before that I was even a less good painter, and before that I was even a less good painter, and you know, if I continue, I have, you know, full hope that I become a better painter in a few years than I am now, and then a better painter a few years after that, and a better painter a few years after that, and I don't see any reason to think that I wouldn't keep growing if I keep putting my mind to it.
And all this time you've worked from life, even when you were an amateur.
So when I was an illustrator, I mean, I definitely was
when you're
working
painting.
from photography, right? But yeah, I mean, since finishing college, finishing illustration, you know, basically kind of discovering my first atelier. Yeah, I mean, what that was almost 20 years ago now, I guess. Yeah, has all been from life. Yeah, I mean,
So that
my
answers the
growth
question.
has
You
all
were
been
that
through
person.
that. And yeah, absolutely, right.
Yeah.
And everybody, I mean, ultimately, really,
We all are.
is. I mean,
Yeah, we all
you
were.
know,
Or
nobody like emerged from the womb some master painter, right?
Right.
And here again, right, and this is a distinction that I make a lot, because I think that there's a little bit of a I hear this a lot from people, that and I don't know that this is exactly what you're saying, but it's something I hear a lot from students and things like that they say something along the lines of like, well, I want to be a landscape painter, let's say, but like painting landscape is like really hard. And so maybe if I paint landscapes from photos first to practice, right, then that'll be how I get good at painting landscapes. And then eventually someday, like, I can do it from real life, like once I'm better at painting or something, right? And the thing that I would argue is that if you want to get good at a thing, practice doing that thing, right? Just like to come back to that ragtime piano example, right?
Yeah, but
the way that you're going to get good at playing the piano isn't by recording one hand and then recording another and splicing it into into GarageBand to make it sound like you're playing the piano better. The way to get better at playing the piano is just to sit there at the piano and like muscle through.
Okay,
and
but
get
what
better
you
at
said
playing
without
the
saying
piano.
it, here's the thing. What you're saying without actually saying it, though, is that your priority is not to make good paintings. It's to be a good painter. Because
I don't
if
know
they
exactly
could,
that's what I'm saying.
well, here's why I think this is what you're saying. And yeah, obviously, if I'm wrong, correct me. But in the earlier example you gave with the music,
Yeah.
you had said yeah, maybe they can mix it in GarageBand, you know, in 2 separate tracks and make it sound like the music they were inspired by. Maybe they could, but then they weren't actually doing it, right? So they didn't actually play it the way the original musician played it. It's something different, right?
Right.
What that tells me is that even though they got the same result, you seem more interested in the former artist who did it themselves, who did it with their own skills, not with a machine, right? So to me, it sounds like you're not just interested in the quality of your art as perceived by others. You're interested in actually doing something hard yourself. That's what it sounds like to me.
In a way, I mean, I think I would maybe break it down slightly differently. I mean, in that I don't actually think if you splice it together in GarageBand, it is the same thing ultimately.
No, I didn't say the same thing. I said perceived
I
by the
think
public as just as good. Or maybe
Yeah.
that's what I mean.
I definitely one thing that I think definitely say is my interest is definitely in my own opinion and evaluation of what I'm doing.
Right.
More so than someone else's, I think. And I think that, yeah, to me, it definitely has to be a process that I find interesting and engaging and worthwhile and honest. If I, you know, if there was I don't know, let's say some filter I could put on my painting in Instagram that made it look better to other people, I wouldn't be like terribly interested.
Mhm.
I mean, it would in some ways feel kind of dishonest
Yeah, I agree.
to me. But I think that in some ways, the thing that I would maybe say more so even is that I wouldn't, and I think this is maybe more the way I would frame it in my mind, is that I wouldn't be particularly inclined towards letting impatience derail me from the pursuit of something potentially great. Meaning that I think to do what I'm ultimately interested in doing, to do what I'd ultimately like to do, I think the path there is the path ultimately that I'm taking, right? That to say, well, I could do this and it might kind of look like I was a better painter than I really am, right? Is like a detour, right? Because now what am I doing? Now I'm doing some other thing, right? Now I'm not really pursuing the thing that I was originally interested in, that I was trying to do, that held my interest. Now I'm kind of on this side track, like doing this side quest, right? To, you know, sort of make some other goal happen, right? Would be kind of the way that I would maybe think about that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess there is
You
a subtle difference there. So I get when I started working from life many years ago, it was because I just finished a multi-figure painting, and I thought, you know, I mean, I've never been a huge fan of my own work, but I, you know, got some compliments from people, you know, saying that it was a good painting, blah, 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 blah. But I was sort of like, yeah, but the old masters, they did it without photography. And I remember looking at a Da Vinci book and seeing all the studies from the Last Supper, and they were all sort of weird and awkward. I mean, Da Vinci, his figures were often weird and awkward, just like even Rembrandt's were sometimes. It's a product of not using a camera, right?
Yeah.
And some people, not to get off on a tangent, but some people would argue that is what made them not as good as the 19th century. You obviously don't feel that way, but some people would. But even in the awkwardness of all the studies, I was like, oh, there's something, and I definitely totally agree with you on this. There's something charming about it. Like this, there's something more human about the awkwardness, because you see the struggle, you see the artist's decisions rather than the kind of like just mundane copying of a flat image, right? And so I thought, nope, I got to prove to myself that I can do this thing, like that I can make a complex multi-figure painting without cameras. And that sent me on that whole 14-year journey.
Yeah.
And the way I looked at it throughout that time was maybe a little different than what you're describing, but I'm not 100% sure. I looked at it more like a race, and I saw myself, I'm gonna say winning races just to make the point. Obviously, it's not a competition, right? But I saw my relative success up till that point, as you might say, as winning the race, right? I'm making money, I'm selling paintings. It's like winning the race, so to speak. I didn't want to win the race on a motorcycle against old masters who were doing it on foot. You know what I mean? Like, it meant nothing to me to do something they were doing if using a motorcycle when they were running. Right. And it just felt like I felt like a fraud. And so for a long time, I was just like, I got to prove to myself that I can do this thing without the motorcycle, so to speak. Yeah. And I can actually win this race without it. And that's what I was kind of wondering if you have that same sentiment. But it seems to me that it's a subtle difference with you. I'm not sure I completely understand it yet, but it seems like for you, it's more about the thing. Like there's something about the thing that's created when working from life that's different, that you're after. Where for me, it was more about, I'm more interested in the artist than the art. Like I want to be a great artist. I'm less interested if people perceive me that way. I just want to be good.
Yeah.
Right. And so maybe it's different. I'm not sure I totally understand the distinction.
Well,
but I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
I think that's part of it, right? I mean, definitely, and I think that, there again, right? Like if we use that analogy, right, of the race and the motorcycle, right? To me, I mean, yeah, on one hand, it's, and I don't even necessarily, and I actually relate to that a lot, that idea, because, I remember back when I was in college and doing illustration work and stuff, and, I'd kind of make, some illustrations of some people or something, and it was all photo referencey. And yeah, I mean, people would say like, oh my God, you're like the next Rembrandt. And you're kind of like, I just traced a photo. I don't think you realize how how simple this actually was to do. There was kind of a slightly hollow feel to, receiving a compliment like that, because I knew I wasn't doing the same thing as them, right? But even more so than that, to use the running a race analogy, I mean, imagine, if you were a runner, right, and your whole life was like running and you just loved to run, and you'd wake up every morning excited to get out there and run, right? And I'm not a runner, but I know runners, and I know how, they feel about it, right? And they'll talk about that. They just love it. I mean, they live to run, right? And then it's like if somebody came and said, well, you could win this race if you just ride this motorcycle, right?
Yeah.
You'd be like, well, yeah, but that's not
running.
Yeah. That's not the thing I love. I don't love motorcycles, right? Now there's motorcycle races out there for people who love motorcycles, right? That, if you want to race on a motorcycle, have a motorcycle race, right? That's fine. But it's not the thing that I love as that runner, right?
Oh, that's
and so
interesting.
Like, what would the point of that be for me, right? But there again, I mean, to come back to the thing, right? The thing itself. I mean, I do actually think that the thing is different. in the end,
Yeah.
right? And I would argue that the thing made through my own struggling and figuring it out and, working from the real deal, I would argue is ultimately a better thing than the thing that I would make from a photo, or a thing that I like more, at least, right?
Yeah.
And I always use the example of animal painting, right? Because like pre-photography animal painting is like kind of my favorite thing in the
They're
world.
so weird, though, some of them.
They're so weird.
So you just like the weird.
It's not so much that I would like, and this is a distinction I make too, right? Is that none of those guys were trying to make it weird, right?
No, of course not.
They
They just
were
didn't
all
know.
doing their absolute
Yeah.
best to paint a lion or whatever, right? And if there's like some weirdness to that, then like maybe there's some weirdness to that, right? But that's part of it, right? That's part
Yeah.
of the thing. I still like that thing better than when I see somebody paint a lion perfectly from a photograph. Like it's just a thing that I love more. Weirdness and all. I wouldn't even say it's because of the weirdness necessarily, right? But you sort of take it as part of the package in a way, right? It's this handmade thing that has this character to it. Um, that definitely, you listen to some recording of, I don't know, some Delta blues singer or something, right? And maybe they flub a word here and there, or something happens in the recording, and it's part of the thing, right? That it's messy. It is what it is. It's a human being making a thing, right? And like, do I think that that would be better if somebody put it into some computer program and like edited it to like clean it up? Like, I don't know. I don't actually think it would make it better, right? That I think that human made quality to things is part of their appeal,
Okay, so this is interesting. I think the hang up is, maybe it's not a hang up, but the distinction might be on how we define better. And it seems to me that you just really love the humanity behind the creation of the piece. And it seems to me that in a way makes it better. Even if you have a horse that has a gallop that's completely unnatural because they can't pre-camera, they had no idea how horses jumped and ran, and they couldn't follow their legs fast enough.
Yeah.
But to you, it doesn't matter because it was made by a human hand and the human ingenuity. And so that, in a way, that human ingenuity sort of imbues the piece with more value.
In a way, I would argue again, I mean, to use the Rosa Bonheur, example, I mean, I would argue that in a lot of ways, I mean, I think that the fact that they couldn't figure out exactly how a horse gallops maybe forced them into inventing something, right? It forced them into making some decisions. And I think that a lot of times those things that they came up with, those designed poses, to my mind, actually kind of are better than like 99% of the photos out there, right?
Right.
That like, you actually may have gotten a more elegant pose through having to make those decisions, right? Rather than having that option to say, okay, well, this is what the photo says a horse looks like, and so I'm gonna,
But
trust
again,
that, right?
she was able to make decisions where an amateur might not have been. But your main goal, though, is to become the type of artist, you already are, in my opinion, but to become the type of artist that can make these sophisticated decisions without technology.
Yeah.
Okay. So I got one more analogy for you, and I just, because I'm just want to understand your perspective on this. I think our perspectives, they definitely overlap significantly, but it's interesting how they're different because I still feel really strongly about this. You know, if I could work from life for the rest of my career, I'd do it. I decided not to for that reason I explained.
Mhm.
Because I freaking love it. And I agree with you on so many levels. But here's my other analogy. If I gave you two pieces of furniture, in this case, I think I could argue, well, oh, no, I couldn't, because your argument's going to blow this up. But I'll ask it anyway. If I gave you two pieces of furniture, okay, let's say they're two secretaries, and they're sitting in a showroom. They look identical, and they have, one of them is slightly more, and you ask the salesperson, why is that one more? And they said, well, because that one was all made by hand with hand tools in, Joe Schmo's garage. This one was made on a CNC machine by a computer. Would you pay more for the handmade one?
Well, I think there'd be a lot of other factors maybe involved in that
No, if
decision.
they were identical.
But yeah. Well, I mean, do I like the idea of supporting like a craftsman and giving my money to them rather than a computer? Yeah.
Is that the only reason though?
It would definitely be one reason in that case. But I don't know. It's hard to say. I would argue that I don't think the thing would be the same thing.
Okay, that's what I want
Right.
to know. Right. I agree with you. Yeah.
Now, I don't know. I guess I'm just not somebody who pays a lot of money for furniture.
Let's
and
say
stuff,
pay the
but,
same. I think that makes the point. They're the same price. Which one would you prefer?
I would definitely take the one, made
That's
by a
handmade.
person.
Yeah.
I think that is definitely like and I mean, I don't know. There's so many questions I could ask about the origins of these two things, right?
Don't overthink it.
But, who's getting the money if I buy the computer-made one, versus who's made, But
let's just say an old man owns the computer and it's a business, and the old man made it with hand tools. You're giving money to an old man either way. I'm trying to make this as simple as possible.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's sort of a slightly imperfect analogy, again, because I don't think the two things would ever actually be the same.
Well, that's the point of the analogy, though. They're not. I agree. They're not the same. They look exactly the same, but they're not the same.
Yeah.
In how they're made. So are you suggesting they wouldn't even look exactly the same way? It would be impossible for the craftsman to make one like the computer? Is that what you're suggesting? Or are you saying they're different because of how they were made?
Well, so one of those two things has to be true, right? I mean, either they're legitimately identical in every conceivable way, or they're not, right? And the thing that I would say is, I mean, if they're absolutely indistinguishable, then I don't know that I would have a preference, right? Now, my suspicion would be that the handmade one, like somewhere down the line, has some things about it, maybe inside, that are structurally stronger, right, than the computer-made one. That's what I mean, though. I mean, either they're completely identical things or they're not. If they're two completely identical things made by the same person in two different ways, I don't know that I particularly would have a preference. My argument would be, I guess, that I think it's not possible that they would be exactly the same, right? That there would have to fundamentally be some difference between them, right? At least in terms of, like, as we're using it as an analogy for painting.
Yeah, maybe that's not a good analogy. You don't do woodworking, I assume.
I have, actually. When I was younger, I did a little bit.
Oh, did you really? Okay.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking of a furniture company here in Salt Lake that is the most premier furniture company in the state, and they use CNC machines. Their furniture is off the charts incredible. But they're also capable of doing it by hand. And you literally can't tell the difference structurally.
Yeah.
You can't tell the difference. The only reason they use CNC machines is because they have too much work and they have to get it out. So the CNC machine just cuts your dovetails instead of you cutting your dovetails. The CNC machine, you know, cuts your rails and stiles and turns your turned legs instead of you turning them on a lathe, right?
Right.
But it's all the same parts. It's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just one's made by hand and one's made by machine. So maybe you don't have an answer for that. I'm just trying to dig deep and kind of figure out exactly what motivates you, because I find this topic really interesting. I'm still not sure I completely understand. My audience is going to be commenting, Jeff, you're an idiot. He said it like 15 times. He just likes to paint.
That's definitely part of it. But yeah, I mean, and you know, in the same way, I mean, if I was a woodworker, I could definitely imagine, you know, wanting to make furniture by hand just because I like making furniture by hand, right?
Right.
And saying I'm not really interested in using a computer. And it's not to say that, you know, I mean, just to be clear, I mean, you know, it's not like I'm anti-technology or anything. I mean, you know, I get that we're talking on a computer right now.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I would argue that on some level, the painting made using the photo and the AI or the whatever is fundamentally going to be different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, an example, right? I mean, a while back, you know, I posted a little just picture of some sketches that I made of my dog, you know, and my dog, she's this little fluffy white dog. She's like 6 pounds. Never will, you know, never in a million years is she going to sit and pose for me. But I had this idea that I really wanted to paint my dog, right? And I was like, you know, I'm just going to paint my dog out of my head, right? Just totally from memory, imagination. I'm not going to look at anything, you know. And see how it goes, right? And so, you know, I made a handful of little, you know, oil sketches.
Do you have these on Instagram?
Yeah.
Oh,
it's on
this is a good segue then. Let's look on your Instagram.
And you'll see it's got sort of a brown background. It's got 4 or 5 little white dog heads. That's my dog Gnocchi.
Is it a Maltipoo by any chance?
She is a Bolognese.
Oh, because I have Maltipoos that look a lot like her.
Oh, right. Yeah, she gets mistaken for a Maltipoo a lot.
Yeah.
That's
so is this it right here? Or is this something you were inspired by?
That's that was at one of the old master auctions here in the city.
That is so bizarre.
Christie's or Sotheby's. I've got a whole series on my Instagram of I take pictures of her in front of old paintings of fluffy white dogs.
That's hilarious. Yeah, but you see how weird these dogs are. But you find this better in a way.
I do.
Okay.
And there she is.
Oh, there it is. That's pretty good, man.
So you can see there's like, you know, zoomed in detail shots, you know, to the right.
That's awesome.
You know, they're just little paintings that I made sort of out of my head. And like, I know they're weird, right?
Feels like an Ewok a little bit.
Like, I know that they're not, you know, perfect or anything like that, right? There again, it's not like I was trying to make them weird. I was just trying to paint my dog out of my head, right?
It's hard to do. Yeah.
It's very hard to do. But there is a part of me that still likes that better than in terms of the actual result. I mean, I like the process better than painting it from a photo, but I actually also kind of like the end result, right? I mean, like, do I know I could make a more photographic looking portrait of her if I did it from a photo? Of course, right? But again, to me, would it actually be better or would it just be more photographic? To me, I think it would just be more photographic.
Is it just me or the rest of you guys also get weirdly excited when you order new paint? Because I don't know about you, but when I get paint in the mail, it feels like Santa just dropped my Christmas presents off at my doorstep. With Vasari Paint, my paint of choice and the podcast sponsor, it's even more exciting. And let me show you why. Because when Vasari shows up, it comes in this incredible box where each tube lays in this little compartment perfectly formed around the tube in this nice soft foam. And it's surrounded by velvet, red velvet. Now you got to ask yourself, if a paint comes so carefully protected and surrounded by red velvet, you got to wonder if this paint is worthy of royalty. It is. Vasari is. So if you haven't tried Vasari, you're seriously missing out. And the thing about Vasari, it's not only the best paint out there, it's also made by an incredible company that's been around for 30 years and knows its customer by name. Do yourself a favor, go to vasaricolors.com and order yourself some for your next painting.
Yeah, man, I'm still not sure I understand you, but here's what I think. I think that you love the process of painting, and you are aspiring to be a great painter, and so you see the struggle in this type of activity of these older painters, and in that struggle you find the charm and the value. That's what it seems like to me. Right. And I, if that's the case, I can totally relate to that. I remember one time seeing a painting of some sheep in the Springville Museum of Art. And I swear these sheep are the coolest things. The wool looked fine. You could tell that the guy must have just he could have just draped wool over a barrel and did the wool. Right. But the faces were like these dogs kind of.
Yeah.
And they just looked like little people almost. They just had they had these personalities that was just too cool. But I think what I loved so much about them, I don't know, but part of it was that character, but part of it was just knowing that the artist is in that, behind that it's 100% the artist. It's like that artist. Yeah. There's nothing else there. There's no other influence besides the artist's intuition, the artist's skills, the artist's training, and the artist's personal experience with that animal. Yeah. To me, that was really appealing when I see that. But I still am not sure if that's what you're getting at with this whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a part of it, you know. That, yeah, I mean, and I think another maybe way you can think about it is, and this is, you know, sort of one way I think about it. I always come back to this, you know, idea that like painting and drawing really developed, I mean, as a way of making an image, right? That, you know, before photos and things like that existed, right? This whole language sort of developed, and in an awful lot of ways, it's very, you know, non-photographic, right? I mean,
right.
And in some ways it's like, well, duh, yeah. But it's actually quite different. I mean, that you look at a Rembrandt, you look at a Rubens, you look at something like that, right? It's definitely not aesthetically very similar to a photograph at all, right? It's very much its own language that was sort of developed in its own way, right? And one way you can, you know, one analogy I use a lot is it's a lot like cuisines, right? That, you know, in different parts of the world, different cuisines evolved based on what was available, right? And so, you know, people are going to eat different things in China than in Africa in, you know, traditional diets because they've got very different access to different ingredients, right? And now, I mean, we're, you know, obviously in this, you know, sort of global world where things travel all around and you kind of get anything all over the place. But those cuisines persisted, right? I mean, because there's a tradition and there's this rich history and there's all this stuff associated with a culture's cuisine, right? And I think that in an awful lot of ways, you know, paintings now, because photography is such a dominant force, I mean, just in our world in general, it's almost as though paintings are expected to speak in sort of the vernacular of photography, right? That all of a sudden things are supposed to be very photographically photographic looking in order to be considered sort of believable or realistic or something
Yeah.
like that, right? That if, somebody like Rubens came along now, right, we'd be like, well, that's not very realistic, right?
Right.
But of course it is. It's just speaking in the language of its own medium, right? It's speaking in the language of painting, in the language of drawing that developed, through all these artists and all over all these centuries and through all these different countries and all these things. And I think there's somewhat of an expectation now, right, that if something isn't kind of like photographic feeling, that it's, wrong or clumsy or, sort of not believable or incorrect or something like that, which I think is, very much kind of an unfortunate thing in a sense, right? That, part of it to me, I mean, is also just letting paintings be paintings, right?
Okay.
Letting paintings speak in their own language and not have to answer to photography for what makes a picture, sort of believable or valid in some ways,
Okay. Yeah. I think I'm following you now. So last analogy. It seems like we both love analogies. So if you want to play football and someone comes along and brings a soccer ball onto the field, well, that's probably a bad example because that is football in England. But if someone someone comes onto the football field with a baseball bat,
Yeah.
and you're just like, no, we're playing football. Like, that's a legitimate sport.
Yeah.
You go ahead and you play your baseball, but play it somewhere else. This is where we play football. And it seems to me that that's what I'm hearing. It's like, you love painting for painting. You want a painting to look like a painting. It's not photography. It's painting. And so when you look at, when you paint your dogs and you say they're better from you like them better from imagination, it's because they remain a painting. They haven't crossed that line over into another sport, so to speak. It's that's what you find interesting about it, is that it remains a painting.
You could say that. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and that's, again, where I come back to the idea of like, if I was to, for example, use a photo to paint from, like, in your example earlier, even if it made it better, right? Again, I would argue that it wouldn't make it better. I would argue that it would make it more photographic, right? To me, that's not particularly better.
Right. Okay. It'd be an interesting challenge. It'd be fun to get you on and some other artists and pull up some art done from photos and some done not from photos, and see if everyone could guess which ones were and which ones weren't. I mean, is it possible that a painting could be done using photos and still look like it was done from life?
It would depend. I mean, again, right, going back to the piano analogy, right? Like, is it conceivable that you could ever record the two parts separately and speed them up and fool somebody into thinking that it was, done all live? Of course it's conceivable, right? To me, again, whether or not you can kind of fool somebody is kind of beside the point in some ways.
Right. Because you fooled them playing baseball. I mean, we're mixing metaphors here, but you weren't playing football. Yeah, this is okay. I think I'm starting to understand you. This is good stuff. What I love about your perspective is that it doesn't come from a judgmental place at all. Which I appreciate. It's you love what you love, but you're not saying photos bad, artists who use photos bad. You're saying, this is what I want to do. This is what I love to do.
No, I mean, exactly. Right. And that's why I say, right. I mean, if you want to bring a motorcycle to a foot race, right. There's motorcycle races out there, right? If that's the thing you love, do that thing, right? It's just not the thing that I love and that I want to do, right?
Gotcha.
And, it's like, if, I sometimes use this analogy, right? That if we were film students or something, or filmmakers, right? Like, everyone in the world just about is making films in color, right? At this point in time, right? I mean, every now and again, there's an exception, right? Somebody might make a black and white movie, right? Um, but imagine if there was, like some artist or some, group of artists, or maybe like a school that said, we're actually like, we love black and white film. It's gorgeous, right? Like, we just love that thing. And, I'm going to set up this place, right? Whether it's my studio, whether it's a school, whether it's an institute, whatever it is, that says, yeah, we're just going to devote ourselves to the art of black and white film, right? Because we just love it. We just think it's a gorgeous thing, right? It has this whole aesthetic appeal that's different than color, right? And I think inevitably what it's always kind of met with is like this weird sort of could almost call it like an aggressive skepticism.
Oh yeah.
Right? That they're like, well, why are you doing that thing? Like, what, we have color film now. Like, why aren't you using this? I mean, if Charlie Chaplin were alive right now, he would be
Oh my
making
gosh, I
movies in
hate that
color,
argument.
right?
Oh yeah.
And you're like, yeah, maybe, right? I don't know.
But who
Like,
cares?
sure,
I don't care what Charlie
maybe,
Chaplin would
I
do.
don't know, right?
Yeah.
But like, it's like, okay, yeah, that's great. Like, so 99% of the world can go right ahead making movies in color. That's fine. I'm not telling anybody not to make color movies. I'm just saying, like, I really love this thing that's different from that, right? And like, I'm really interested in making black and white movies, maybe, right?
Yeah.
I always say I'm, and I say this as a, teacher too, is like, I have zero interest in telling anybody what to be interested in, right? That I don't particularly want to go out and tell people what kind of paintings to make, or what kind of paintings they should be making, or whether they should be making paintings, or being photographers, or being chefs. I mean, for that matter, right? I mean, everybody should do the thing that they love and that they're interested in. But for me, it's painting,
Yeah.
that's the thing that I am interested in, that I find fascinating, right? When I look at all the painters who inspire me, who I really, again, just love, they weren't using photos, right? And that's the language that I'm interested in, right? That's the thing that I find fascinating, right? So,
Yeah.
as an instructor, I always say, like, if I have some information that's useful to you as a student, right, that aligns with your interests, then that's great, right? If this isn't what you want, then it's not what you want, right? I mean, then you want to do something else, right? And that's fine, right? There's no problem there. I mean, I would say it's a really big world. I think there's room for everything. But this is the thing that interests me, that
Yeah.
excites me,
That was a good conversation. I think I finally figured it out. Sorry, I'm so slow, man.
Not at all.
All right, well, let's look at your work here. We've been at this a while, man. This has been, I think we're at this 2 hours. So let's look at your work and wrap up. I'm sure you got plenty to do.
Sure.
But, all right. So first of all, here's your fish.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So this is a one-day painting?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Well,
the
the
fish
fish
is 1 day.
and the paper. So there's actually, if you go maybe earlier than that, there's a picture of just that painting that shows some progress shots. That looks probably like it. Yeah. So if you go through to the next image, you'll see,
my goodness, how about
kind of
that?
how it started, right? So I got it. I set it up. I just quickly kind of sketched out with some white chalk and started painting. So if you go,
what an interesting way to paint.
Right there, that one. Go back one real quick. Sorry. That was a 1 day painting. So
what an interesting way to paint. You just start from the mouth and work back.
Yeah.
That's wild. I mean, I guess
Um,
that's kind of what you do at Grand Central with the figure.
More or less, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so the one with the fish and then the paper underneath, that one, right? If it had stopped there, that would be a 1 day painting,
Wow.
right? And then I, got rid of the fish because it was, done at that point after sitting out all day. Uh, and then I came back over the course of a couple other days to put in the pot and the background and the background. It took me a while to decide what I wanted to do in the background. I wasn't really sure, so I let it sit for a while. And I wound up the background, the wall in the back is just kind of made up,
Hmm.
from imagination in the final painting. Um,
So you said you threw the fish away?
yeah,
Have you
yeah.
considered taping it to a wall? There's a really good market for that.
That's what I'm told. That's what I'm
Yeah.
told. Yeah.
Wasted opportunity, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. All right, let's see what else you got. So when you're doing the birds, are you using taxidermy?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm using taxidermy more or less depending on the bird. I mean, in some way or another, I'm usually using it. Um, Oftentimes, these were fairly straightforward. These were little studies that I did. They're all the same duck, but it's positioned in different ways and kind of playing with poses and stuff. These were some little studies I did before doing a bigger painting. So I've got a kind of a bigger composition that has some little ducklings in it, and this I did prior to that painting just
Wow.
to kind of play with some ideas. There's one of some like little chicks too that were kind of done in a same way where I took one my yeah, right there on the right, yeah, where it was one or two little taxidermy chicks. The poses are pretty different. So I was just playing with kind of taking this one stiff sort of taxidermy and trying to sort of invent poses. So I'd kind of move it around and just come up with different poses and stuff out of my head to try and just play with like, okay, what kind of different gestures and expressions and things could
Wow.
I kind of squeeze out of this thing?
This one is awesome right here.
Oh, thanks. I think there's a detail of that one in the
That's
if you
impressive.
flip to the um but yeah, just again trying to just play with kind of different ideas based
Huh.
on sort of a stiff pose of the actual taxidermy.
Yeah, yeah, this really reminds me of what you were talking about earlier with just this idea of posing the animals oneself and creating these more dynamic, more interesting, more almost human like poses. I mean, it's like he's gonna get up and it's like he's dancing. It's just really, really cool.
Thanks.
I just love that. Yeah, I can't imagine
Thanks.
you'd ever catch that exact pose with a photo. You
It'd
might get
be pretty
lucky.
unlikely,
It'd be pretty
right?
unlikely.
You know, yeah, yeah,
And this was in the slideshow, but I just think
yeah.
this is
Same.
gorgeous.
Oh, thanks.
Man, oh man.
Yeah, the same idea, right? I mean, I had a few different, little taxidermies, and I was kind of trying to, uh, in the painting, squeeze out kind of different expressions and attitudes and stuff out of them a little bit. Um,
Hmm.
you know, uh,
Wow. Yeah, these are gorgeous. So
oh,
you
thanks.
paint rather thin. Are you using soft, small brushes? What?
In this case, I mostly was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it kind of depends, and it depends on the painting too. So sometimes if it's a more full composed picture, I'll usually have kind of maybe some kind of an underpainting, then kind of a main layer on top. Maybe make some adjustments at the end.
Hmm.
Like this one, for example, right? This had an initial drawing worked out on paper, that I transferred onto the canvas. And had an underpainting and all that. So the paint will build up, a little bit thicker in something like that. But if it's just a little direct study like those little chicks or ducklings, it's just kind of one layer, right? Because it's just one go basically.
So when you outline like this and come right up to the edge, how do you manage from day to day to make the edges so that you don't end up with this sort of cutout sticker kind of bird?
So this layer in this one, this is just the underpainting. So this is basically the embauche layer. Everything will get kind of a slightly scrubby layer like that. And then I'll come back and paint, kind of the main layer basically on top of that. But it's not that hard really. I mean, as long as your, values and your forms and everything are doing what they need to be doing, it usually doesn't take that much work to just get an edge a little bit, softened out.
Do you have to re-wet sometimes? Like re-wet, on the top layer? Let's say you painted. Let's say you painted this background first, and then the next day you painted the vase. Do you have to re-wet the edge of the background sometimes to get the layer, to get the edges right?
It depends, but sometimes I'll oil out a little bit, just like around an object, if there's dry stuff behind it,
to let it bleed.
Just to like lubricate the paint a little bit. But not always. It depends, but yeah, I mean, you can also just, if you kind of tap the edge a little bit, you can just slightly soften it out when you're painting that.
Even on top of the dry painting.
Yeah, as long as your color that you're using works.
Right, Yeah. Your process reminds me of Carlo Russo.
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah. He's great.
He is. He's really good. But I mean, your paintings are very different, but your approach, as far as I can tell, looks very similar.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with his process, but it would make sense. I mean, I think that we're, likely, I mean, just going by looking at his work, I mean, I think we're probably inspired by a lot of the same.
Yeah, he loves the Dutch still life painters, big time.
So, I think that would make sense if there were some similarities, I think,
Now the way that you make things glow, the first time I saw that was David Leffel back when I was in school.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Oh, yeah, he's great.
It's such a great effect. Where you did it with the lemons, where are those lemons?
Oh, I think they're probably further down.
It's just such a cool effect.
Oh, thanks.
Where is it? Let's see. Oh, right. Well, here's not the whole painting, or I guess it is the whole painting, but it's shared with the other painting. Yeah, that's just amazing. And obviously you don't see that. So that's obviously some artistic license there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a real effect, right? I mean, that sort of corona effect that you'll sometimes get light, bouncing off of things like that. But it's definitely amped up for effect for sure, Yeah.
Yeah. The way it's almost like, I'm going to use a photographic reference here, which is ridiculous because you don't use photos, but it's like you created this blown out highlights effect on it, which is really cool. It doesn't look photographic at all. That's not what I'm getting at, but I don't know how else to describe it, but it just makes those lights glow incredibly. Just gorgeous. So, oh, and then you've got some figures. Don't see a lot of that. Awesome.
Yeah, those are pretty old.
Back from school or what?
School. Yeah.
So you always start with an embauche. Is that what you call that? That's a new term for me. I just recently learned that term. Maybe you could explain what it is.
Yeah. So an embauche is basically, it's a type of underpainting, right? I mean, and there's lots, a million different types of underpaintings that people use, but basically it's just a thinned out full color version of what your final painting is going to be, right? So it's a little thin, little scrubby, little transparent usually. Um, and in this case, I again, if I'm going to do like a more kind of composed, thought out picture, usually, if I'm doing an underpainting, that's usually kind of the type of underpainting I tend to use. Um, this one in particular was like a little alla prima, so it was all in the same day.
Mm.
It sort of was like an underpainting, I guess, but I was just kind of basically mapping out some shapes for myself with some thinned out paint in this case. And so it depends. I mean, in terms of like a 1 day painting, I don't always do them if it's something that I'm gonna again, kind of have thought out and planned, a little bit more in terms of like a full composition. I'll usually kind of do an eboche as an
Mm.
underpainting.
Is there a particular kind of lighting you prefer? It looks like it's all soft lit. So I'm assuming a
Most,
window or something.
yeah, so it depends. Different ones were done in different places, different studios. So
Hmm.
for a while, I had a studio that had a skylight, which was really nice. And it was all natural. But since then, I mean, I had a softbox light for a while. My current studio does not have natural light, so I've got sort of like an LED panel
And that
type
works.
light.
That works well for you.
Yeah, works fine.
Okay.
I mean, natural light is great, right? Like if I could click my heels together and have a north-facing window in my studio, I definitely would, because I mean, natural light's just gorgeous, um, but at the moment I don't.
This
So
one
I've
looks
got
like
an
it's
LED
natural
light.
light.
That one was natural light,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, yeah.
Man, oh man. That's incredible.
Thanks.
Yeah. So it looks like you use relatively smooth canvas.
It depends, I think that one recently I've been using kind of rougher canvases a
Hmm.
little bit, which I think this one was on too, is Clausen 66, which
Hmm.
is a canvas I use a lot these days, which has a little more texture to it, but
Hmm.
it varies. I use different ones at different times.
Right. Well, let me just real quick. I'm going to go over to your website here because it's got a bunch of bigger. Well, it looks like a lot of really complete paintings. Oh,
Oh
this
yeah.
one looks so much better here than on Instagram. Why
Oh,
is that?
thanks.
On Instagram, it's darker.
Oh, it could be a different photo. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Um,
My goodness, man. Yeah, if you want to, while I flip through, if you want to comment, this is weird.
oh yeah. That's
You know someone with a glass eye?
my girlfriend owns that actually.
Really?
She
That is
yeah,
crazy.
we sort of share props sometimes, but
Oh, your girlfriend's a
um
painter?
she is,
Is it
yeah.
someone I would
Um
know?
Maybe her name's Kristen Nikitin.
I'll have to look her up.
And yeah, the glass eye was I was invited to be in a project. It was a book project somebody was doing, which I think never actually wound up happening. And the glass eye I was doing, it was part of a triptych for that I was doing for that, but then it never happened. And I did two parts of the triptych and never did the third. And so then I
Hmm.
just split them up and now it's just a standalone. That was a demo I did for a workshop ages ago.
Wow. That's a
Um,
demo.
yeah.
Wow. Multiple days or?
Yeah. It was a 2 week workshop. And so we went through a whole process, basically of talking through the steps of, kind of what I would do for a more complex painting, right? So basically the idea was I was using this simple subject just so that we could get through it and get it done in the 2 weeks with teaching and everything. But so it was kind of a more robust process than I would usually use for painting something that simple, but it was sort of a vehicle to talk process. So we did a drawing, transferred it onto a canvas, did an underpainting, did a separate color study, and then did like the final layer of the painting over the course of a couple weeks.
Wow. Man, those colors are just so sensitive. You go cooler yellow, warm, cool, cool Terminator, and then warm reflected light. Man, so beautiful.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, is there any that you'd personally like to look at that I haven't already pulled up?
Oh, it's up to you. No,
Okay.
not especially.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been fun, man. Like I
Yeah,
said, we've gone
yeah.
like 2.5
Good.
hours. It's been a good
Yeah.
conversation. So I have one final question for you before we close up here. If you could give one piece of advice to an aspiring artist, what would it be?
Oh, I guess there's so many ways you could think about that. I think probably, I would say, definitely, I think follow whatever your interest is. Let that sort of dictate your path in some ways. And I think that I always say I think I've taken a very weird path through a lot of things that way. But I think that, whatever, kind of quirky interests you might have, I think follow them, right? And trust in that, to a certain degree, and I think that, will tend to be the thing that, makes you the artist that you are, and I remember I had a teacher once who said, they said you should do what you like to do, because if it's something you don't like to do, you're not going to want to do it. And somebody else is really going to like doing that thing, and they're going to want to do it, and they're going to do it more, and they're going to be better at it than you.
That's good advice.
And they were like, do the thing that you enjoy doing. And, that's going to kind of determine the artist that you become, and I think in some ways it's pretty good advice,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And thanks again, Devin. This has been
Hey,
a great
thank
conversation.
you for having me. Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, it was fun for me. Hope to get you back on the podcast someday.
Yeah, anytime.
Thanks for tuning in to the Undraped Artist Podcast. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you could, leave a comment or review. That really helps the channel. Please share the show with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, consider a monthly donation at theundrapedartist.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.